2005, Elias Thorne, a celebrated wilderness photographer, vanished deep in the Alaskan wild after leaving one chilling satellite phone message. "You won't believe this. I've found something." Search teams found his camp, his gear, and a single red strap from his backpack, but not Elias, for 20 years. The mystery grew colder until a hiker stumbled upon Elias's long-lost camera, buried beneath silt. Inside lay the final images he ever captured, clues powerful enough to rewrite everything we thought we knew. The river was running low that summer, its current sluggish, dragging fallen leaves and scraps of driftwood across the shallows. It was the kind of place most hikers passed without much notice, just another bend in the endless Alaskan wilderness. But on that late August afternoon, Jonah Keller, a 32-year-old schoolteacher from Anchorage, noticed something wedged beneath the roots of a half-fallen alder tree. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a chunk of black plastic. But when Jonah crouched and tugged it free, his stomach tightened. It was a digital Cameron old model, coated in silt and algae, its strap frayed to threads. The buttons were stiff, the lens scratched, but on the back was a faded sticker. The name was barely legible, but Jonah read it twice to be sure. E. Thorne. He had heard that name before. Anyone from Alaska old enough to remember 2005 had. Elias Thorne, the wilderness photographer who disappeared without a trace. His face had once stared out from missing person posters, his story whispered in diners and on late-night radio shows. 20 years later, the case was a ghost, a story most people had stopped telling. Jonah turned the camera over in his hands. The battery slot was rusted, but the memory card, small, thin, still tucked inside, looked intact. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Jonah slipped the camera into his backpack. It felt less like finding lost gear and more like disturbing a grave. That evening, in the parking lot of a small-town library, Jonah asked a teenager working at the local photo shop if he could take a look at the memory card. The boy slid it into his reader, his eyes widening as images flickered onto the screen. "Most of them are damaged," he said, "but a few, they're still there." Jonah leaned closer. The first usable photo showed a vast ridgeline bathed in pale dawn light. Another showed a cliffside, jagged and sharp, with shadows pooled at its base. Then came the one that made Jonah's chest tighten, the final clear frame. Elias stood in the foreground, his face weathered, hair whipped by the wind, smiling faintly as if he had just uncovered a secret. Behind him, partially hidden in shadow, was something strange. The corner of a wooden sign with 3 faded letters, RB, and at the edge of the frame, caught in the light, was a sliver of fabric, red, the same color as the missing backpack the search teams had hunted for 2 decades ago. Jonah stepped back from the monitor, his pulse hammering. This wasn't just an old photograph. It was a fragment of a mystery that had haunted Alaska for 20 years. And now, it seemed, the wilderness was finally giving back its secrets. The autumn air in Denali carried a crisp bite, the kind that promised winter was not far behind. Elias Thorne tightened the straps of his red backpack and gazed out over the valley below. His journals, later found in his cabin, revealed his obsession with documenting landscapes that no one else dared to reach. He wanted not just beauty but discovery. That September, he had told friends in Anchorage that he was setting out for a final project, though he never explained what it was. His closest confidant, a fellow photographer named Clara Reed, remembered the strange tone in his voice. "There's something out there," Clara, Elias had said, eyes glowing with a restless fire. a place no one talks about. I've heard the stories, and I need to see it myself. Clara had begged him to wait. Locals whispered about dangerous stretches of land near an abandoned mining site north of Fairbanks. Hunters spoke of eerie sounds like voices carried on the wind. The maps marked the area with nothing but ridges and forests, yet older townsfolk called it Arbor Hollow. Few went near, but Elias was not a man who listened to warnings. On September 12th, he checked out of a roadside lodge with 2 weeks of supplies. His red backpack slung over one shoulder, his camera swinging from his neck. Witnesses said he seemed unusually cheerful, humming under his breath as he walked into the wilderness trail. One clerk recalled him mentioning, "If I don't make it back, at least I'll have seen it." She had thought he was joking. For the next 6 days, Elias moved deeper into the valley, leaving faint traces of his passage boot prints, scraps of campfire ash, and a page torn from his notebook that searchers later found. On it, he had scrawled, "The forest shifts. At night, it doesn't sound right. Trees feel closer in the morning, like it's breathing." Then, on September 18th, he seemed to vanish. The official search lasted 3 weeks. Helicopters swept the valley. Rangers hiked ridges, calling his name until their voices cracked. His red backpack was never found, nor his camera. All that remained was a single torn glove caught on a branch near a narrow ravine. Rumors spread, faster than facts. Some claimed Elias had staged his disappearance for fame. Others whispered darker theories that he had stumbled upon something hidden, something not meant to be photographed. Clara Reed, devastated, told reporters Elias wasn't reckless, he was drawn, like the land was calling him. By winter, the case went cold. His family held a memorial with no body to bury. The photographs that might have explained his journey were presumed lost forever until, 2 decades later, Jonah Keller stood in a dim photo shop, staring at Elias' smile frozen in time with the shadow of Arb behind him. It was no longer just a legend. The mystery had returned. Jonah Keller sat alone in his dim apartment in Portland, the glow of his laptop casting harsh lines across his tired face. The envelope from the thrift shop lay open beside him, its contents spread across the table, a bundle of weathered photographs, their edges curled and brittle with age. Most were stunning frozen rivers glistening under pale sunlight, ridges carved by glaciers, endless forests vanishing into fog. Classic Elias Thorne. But one photo made Jonah's stomach twist. Elias stood, smiling in the foreground, holding his tripod, the vast Alaskan wilderness unfurling behind him. But it wasn't his expression or the grandeur of the scene that unsettled Jonah. Was the faint lettering, scratched into the side of a wooden post jutting from the ground. 3 crude letters. Arb. Jonah leaned closer, tracing the letters with his finger. It didn't look like random graffiti. It looked deliberate. He had never heard of Elias before, stumbling on the envelope at the shop, but the name kept circling back to him. Elias Thorne, vanished, 2005. Photographer, cold case. The clerk's casual remark echoed in his head. Strange. Huh? Some guy dropped it off with old hiking gear. Said he didn't want it. That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. He searched until dawn, reading every archived article about Elias. The headlines painted a haunting picture. Renowned photographer disappears. Without a trace in Alaskan wilderness, search fails to locate Elias Thorne, 32 last entry. In journal mentions unbelievable discovery, Jonah's hands shook as he scrolled through grainy photographs of search parties, Elias's abandoned campsite, and interviews with a tearful woman identified as Clara Reed. Every detail pulled Jonah deeper, but what rattled him most was an overlooked detail from the official report. Elias's last satellite phone call, placed the evening before he vanished. "You wouldn't believe what I found," Elias had said, his voice recorded faintly on a ranger's voicemail. "It changes everything. I'll send proof." He never called again. Jonah stared at the photograph of the letter Zarb, his mind spun with questions. Was this the proof Elias meant? Was it a place, a code, or a warning? Why had this single photo resurfaced 20 years later, when the rest of his belongings were still missing? By the end of the week, Jonah had abandoned his freelance editing jobs. His friends called him obsessive. His sister left him worried. Voicemails, but he couldn't stop. Every night, he spread the photographs across his table, connecting strings of notes on his wall. Mapping out where Elias might have traveled, he began to dream of Alaska, of endless forests swallowing sound, of Elias's smiling face, frozen forever before the shadow of something no one had dared to name. When Jonah finally booked his ticket north, he told himself it was for closure, just research for an article. But deep down, he knew it was something else. The land that had claimed Elias was calling again, and Jonah Keller was answering. The small plane descended into Fairbanks under a pale September sky, its windows revealing the endless stretch of dark pine forests and jagged ridges below. For Jonah Keller, the sight was both mesmerizing and suffocating. Somewhere within that vast wilderness, Elias Thorne had vanished without a trace 20 years earlier. Jonah carried little more than a backpack, his camera, and the envelope of photographs that had set his obsession aflame. Those images had become more than artifacts. They were a map, a riddle, and a promise. Each ridge, each tree line, each carved letter seemed to draw him deeper into a story that had never found its ending. Waiting for him in Fairbanks was a retired ranger who had been part of the original 2005 search. Grant Holloway was his name, a man who had spent decades navigating the Alaskan backcountry and who had once walked the same trails searching for Elias. Holloway carried with him a weathered silence, the kind born of too many unanswered questions. Together, they drove north for hours, the asphalt giving way to gravel, and then to little more than winding tracks that pressed against the forest's edge. The wilderness seemed to grow denser with each passing mile, swallowing the road, the horizon, and even the light itself. Jonah studied the ridges carefully, comparing them to the photographs. Somewhere out there, Elias had walked with his camera, chasing something extraordinary. Somewhere out there, he had vanished. By dusk, they reached a rustic lodge near the valley where Elias had last been seen. Jonah unpacked in silence, the air heavy with anticipation and unease. That night, unable to sleep, he wandered outside. The forest loomed against the starlit sky, dark and impenetrable. The wind pressed through the trees with an eerie rhythm, and for a moment, Jonah thought he saw it a wooden post, half hidden among the shadows, the faint outline of carved letters glinting under the moonlight. It looked like the same marking. From the photograph, he blinked, and the vision was gone. The trees stood silent once more, unmoving, unyielding. Perhaps it had only been his mind projecting obsessions onto the wilderness. Or perhaps, as Holloway had once hinted, the land itself was alive with echoes of the past. Jonah returned to his room restless, haunted by the image. The valley where Elias had disappeared was waiting for him, and tomorrow he would step into it. The wilderness had kept its secrets for 20 years. Now it would test whether Jonah was strong enough to uncover them. The morning air in Denali carried a sharp chill, the kind that seeped into the bones and warned of winter's approach. Jonah rose early, strapping on borrowed hiking gear and tightening the straps of his pack. Ahead of him stretched the same valley that had swallowed Elias Thorne 2 decades earlier, an expanse of ridges, forests, and silence that seemed untouched by time. The trail into the valley was narrow, bordered by dense spruce and birch. With every step, the wilderness grew heavier, the silence more profound. The sounds of civilization faded quickly, leaving only the crunch of boots against frozen soil and the distant cries of unseen birds. For Jonah, it felt less like entering a forest and more like stepping into another world, one ruled not by people, but by the land itself. It was here, in 2005, that search parties had combed the ridges and riverbeds looking for any sign of Elias. They had found only of a campfire, footprints that led nowhere, a stove left cooling as if its owner had stepped away only moments earlier. And yet, nothing beyond those fragments could explain how a man as skilled and prepared as Elias Thorne had simply ceased to exist now. As Jonah reached the clearing that had once held Elias's final camp, he felt the weight of that mystery press against him. The outline of the old campsite was still faintly visible, the flattened earth where a tent might have stood, the scattered stones of a long cold fire ring. Jonah crouched low, brushing away a layer of moss and soil. Beneath it, something caught his eye, a strip of canvas, bleached by sun and rain, half buried in the ground. It was red. The color stopped him, cold. Elias had been known for his distinctive red backpack, an object mentioned in every report, yet never recovered. The canvas was torn and weather-worn, but there was no mistaking what it had once been a part of. The wilderness had hidden it for 20 years, only to offer it up now. At Jonah's feet, inside the torn fabric, lay fragments of an old fork, the rusted ring of a zipper, and, most chilling of all, a small waterproof notebook swollen with rot. Its pages were warped, the ink blurred, but one line stood out as Jonah carefully opened it. The forest shifts at night. The voices are closer now. The words struck him like a blow. They were Elias's handwriting, his final impressions scrawled. In a moment of unease, they spoke not of misstep or accident, but of something intangible, something that had pursued him in those final nights. Jonah tucked the notebook into his pack, his heart pounding. The valley no longer felt like a place of silence. It felt watchful, alive, as though the trees themselves leaned closer to listen. As the day faded and shadows lengthened across the valley, Jonah felt the first stirrings of doubt. This was not simply an investigation into a cold case. It was a confrontation with something that did not want to be uncovered. And somewhere in the distance, carried faintly on the wind, came a sound that did not belong to the wilderness. It was soft, drawn out, almost like laughter. The valley had begun to answer. The forest grew stranger. With every mile, Jonah pushed deeper. The spruce stood taller here, their trunks blackened with age, their branches twisting together so tightly that daylight broke through only in thin, silvery shafts. The air was damp, filled with the scent of moss and something faintly metallic, as though the earth itself carried a hidden wound. Every step brought Jonah closer to a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to face. The notebook he had found the day before weighed heavily. In his pack, its words echoing in his mind. The forest shifts at night. The voices are closer now. Elias hadn't written about hunger, injury, or exhaustion. He had written about voices. By mid-afternoon, Jonah reached a ridge that overlooked the river where the 2005 search parties had ended their sweeps. Below him stretched a field of rocks scattered by floods and time. Most were smooth, grey, lifeless. But one, near the water's edge, drew Jonah's eyes immediately. It was carved. The shape was crude, but deliberate. A spiral etched into the stone. Its grooves deep enough to have survived years of rain and ice. Jonah knelt beside it, tracing the spiral with his fingers. The marks were too precise to be accidental, too ancient to belong to modern hands. And yet, according to reports, Elias had been fascinated with local legend stories of the Dean. People who believed certain valleys were thin places, where the barrier between worlds faltered. Had Elias discovered this carving himself? Had it meant something to him in those final days? Jonah pulled out the notebook again, turning its fragile pages with care. Between the blurred lines of ink and water stains, another phrase stood out. The stone speaks if you listen long enough. The connection was undeniable. Elias had seen this same carving, had written about it, had perhaps lingered here longer than he should have. As Jonah rose, a sudden sound split the silence a crack, sharp and deliberate, like a branch snapping underfoot. He froze. The ridge behind him was empty, the trees swaying with only the faintest touch of wind. And yet, the feeling of being observed was unmistakable, pressing against his back with the weight of unseen eyes. Night fell quickly in the valley. By the time Jonah made camp, the spiral stone seemed burned into his vision, following him even in the flicker of firelight. The forest creaked and shifted as though alive, its sounds growing stranger, layered. What once might have been the hoot of an owl now seemed to stretch into something almost human low. Mournful, calling sleep came in fragments. In the hours between, Jonah thought he heard footsteps pacing just beyond the ring of firelight. When he rose to check, the forest was empty, his fire still crackling. But when dawn finally broke, Jonah found something waiting at the edge of his camp, a pile of stones. Small, smooth river rocks, stacked into a careful tower no taller than his knee. It hadn't been there the night before. Jonah stared at it in silence, his breath fogging the morning air. It was a sign, deliberate and undeniable. Whether left by human hands or something else, it meant only one thing. The valley was aware of him now. Jonah stood motionless before the stone pile, the cold seeping through his boots. A simple stack of river rocks, and yet it spoke louder than any words could. Someone or something wanted him to know he wasn't alone. He crouched low, studying it carefully. The rocks weren't haphazardly thrown together. They were balanced, each one placed with deliberate care. The topmost stone was flat, etched faintly with scratches that almost resembled letters, though worn by time and weather. Jonah pulled out his camera and snapped several photos. He knew better than to disturb it as he moved on. He noticed other signs scattered through the valley, things the original 2005 search teams must have overlooked, or perhaps dismissed as meaningless. A torn scrap of red fabric fluttering from a low branch, so faded it was nearly grey. The sole of a hiking boot half buried in moss, the stitching rotted but the shape unmistakable. Jonah's chest tightened. Elias's distinctive red backpack had never been found. Could this scrap be from it? He photographed everything, each discovery weighing heavier on him. These weren't random relics of hikers passing through, this was a breadcrumb trail. Almost as if Elias had tried to leave markers. By late afternoon, Jonah stumbled upon a hollow beneath a cluster of leaning spruce trees. Inside, partially protected from rain, lay something far more telling, an old film canister. His hands trembled as he unscrewed the cap. Inside was a roll of film, tightly wound, water-stained at the edges, but miraculously intact. His heart pounded. 20 years had passed since Elias's disappearance, yet this fragile cylinder of memories had survived. It was possible, just possible, that it held the last images Elias ever took. Jonah packed it away with reverence, but as he did, a chill ran through him. The forest had grown eerily silent, as though listening. Not a bird sang, not a branch creaked. Only the faint rush of the river far below broke the stillness. That night, Jonah camped near the hollow, his mind restless with possibilities. As the firelight flickered, he pulled Elias's notebook from his bag, flipping to the final, most fragmented entries. Not alone anymore. The night carries voices. They lead toward the stone, toward the water. Must see what lies beneath. Beneath. Jonah whispered the word aloud, his breath catching. Was Elias pointing toward the river? Toward something hidden, below the surface? The spiral carving, the voices, the sense of being led somewhere, it all converged on the valley's water. Sometime past midnight, Jonah was awakened by a sound that froze him in place, a low, rhythmic thudding, like stones being struck together. It came from the river's direction. He rose slowly, his flashlight cutting across the dark trunks of trees, the beam trembling in his hand. The sound stopped. Silence returned, and then, faint but unmistakable, a voice drifted through the trees. A man's voice, hoarse, strained, speaking only 2 words. "Help me." Jonah's blood turned to ice. Morning came with a pale mist rising from the valley floor, wrapping the spruce trees in veils of silver. Jonah barely slept after hearing that voice, his mind locked between disbelief and dread. Logic told him it couldn't have been real. Years had passed since Elias vanished, but the sound had carried too clearly through the night air to be dismissed as imagination. He packed up camp and moved toward the river. The closer he came, the more the valley revealed its hidden scars. Landslide debris lay scattered along the banks. Tangled branches and boulders pressed together, as if nature itself had conspired to bury something. The river roared, swollen with meltwater, its surface turbulent and opaque, guarding whatever secrets it carried beneath. Jonah followed the shoreline carefully, pausing often to photograph unusual formations. Twice, he spotted markings on stone spirals, similar to the one carved near the earlier cairn. They seemed to align in a subtle pattern, almost like a path guiding him downstream. It was too precise to be coincidence. By midday, he reached a narrow bend where the river carved deep into the earth. Here, the current was calmer, forming a dark pool. It was in this quiet pocket that Jonah noticed something unsettling. Fragments of wood, protruding from the silt at the water's edge. He crouched and brushed away the soil, revealing the remnants of a weathered frame, perhaps from a crate, or from equipment once carried by Elias. The discovery confirmed he was close. If Elias had tried to follow the voices, as his notebook suggested, he might have reached this very spot. The river, relentless and cold, could have consumed him within moments. But Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that more lingered beneath the surface. He set up his small camp nearby, determined to investigate further the next day. That evening, as the sky darkened and the stars bled into view, he sat by the fire reading Elias's fragmented entries again. One line struck him with new force. The water hides it. Beneath, it waits. Jonah closed the notebook and looked toward the river, where the pool gleamed like black glass. The wilderness was silent once more, but his thoughts churned restlessly. What could Elias have meant? What could possibly lie beneath that had been worth risking everything? Just as fatigue began to weigh on him, the sound returned. Stones striking together, rhythmically, like a signal. This time, it came from directly across the river. Jonah gripped his flashlight, scanning the opposite bank. For a fraction of a second, he swore he saw a movement of figure, tall and still. Watching him from between the trees, he blinked, and the figure was gone. The stones ceased. The darkness reclaimed the forest. Jonah's pulse hammered in his ears. He told himself it was a trick of the firelight, shadows twisting into form. Yet deep inside, he knew the valley was no longer empty. The river wasn't just a barrier, it was a threshold, and Jonah had just crossed into Elias's world. Jonah knew the film roll he had found in the hollow was the most important piece of evidence tied to Elias Thorne. For days, he had guarded it carefully, almost afraid to expose it to light. Now, with the river's pool still etched into his mind and the phantom voice echoing in his ears, he decided it was time, at the lodge in Fairbanks. There was an old acquaintance of Grant Hollowayan, amateur archivist with a makeshift darkroom. After 2 days of trekking back, Jonah handed him the canister. The archivist worked silently, unspooling the fragile roll with practiced care. Hours passed in the chemical glow of the red lamp. Jonah sat outside, his nerves stretched thin. Finally, the door creaked open. The archivist's face was pale. He held a strip of negatives with trembling fingers and simply said, "You need to see this." The photographs were grainy but unmistakable. The first few frames showed the valley as Elias had seen it. Towering spruces, jagged ridgelines, the familiar sweep of the river. But the further Jonah looked, the stranger the images became. One photograph captured a spiral carved into stone, nearly identical to the markings Jonah had found himself. Another showed the cairn stacked perfectly, but in this version, the top stone clearly bore the letters Arb, freshly cut, as if Elias had documented it in the moment it was created. Then came the image that stopped Jonah cold. A figure, almost translucent, stood among the trees near the river. It wasn't Elias. The proportions were wrong, the stance unnatural. The figure seemed to be facing the camera directly, though its features were lost to distortion, as if the film itself had recoiled from capturing it. The next few frames were worse. Elias had taken a rapid sequence of shots, each one shakier, more frantic. The riverbank, the dark pool, branches torn and scattered. Then, in the final image, something half submerged in the water, a wooden structure, almost like the remnants of a doorframe, leaning at an angle beneath the surface, a doorway into nothingness. Jonah stared in silence. The archivist refused to say more, pushing the prints across the table as though eager to be rid of them. That night, Jonah pored over the photographs under dim light. Questions spiraled endlessly. Why would Elias photograph these specific details in such rapid succession? What was the figure? And the wooden frame, had it been real, or just an illusion in the water? The most haunting realization was this: Elias had been documenting something deliberately. These weren't random wilderness shots. They were evidence, left intentionally, as if he knew his time was running out. Jonah pressed the photos back into their envelope, his hands unsteady. If Elias had found something beneath the river, something that demanded proof, then Jonah would have to return there, himself. The wilderness wasn't finished with him. It had only begun to speak. Jonah returned to the valley with the photographs sealed inside a waterproof case. each image burning like an unanswered question. The journey back felt heavier, as though every mile of wilderness carried the weight of Elias's unfinished story. The air was colder now, the season shifting toward the first hints of snow. The river greeted him with the same restless roar. The pool where Elias had once stood lay still, black and unyielding. Jonah set up camp nearby, his eyes never leaving the water. He had studied the final photograph countless times, its blurred depiction of a wooden frame beneath the surface. The image haunted him, a suggestion that the river concealed not just debris, but a passage. On his second day there, Jonah began mapping the area systematically. He marked cairns, carvings, and stone spirals with GPS pins, overlaying them against Elias's original roots. A pattern emerged, faint but undeniable. Every marking seemed to lead toward the pool, as though Elias had been guided or driven there. Jonah waded carefully into the shallows, the icy water cutting through his boots. He used a long pole to probe the bottom. Twice the pole struck, something solidly, unmistakably. He felt the shape beneath the current, angles too sharp to be natural. It was there, just as the photograph showed. By dusk, exhaustion forced him back to camp. He built a fire, its flames snapping against the growing chill. As night deepened, the forest seemed to lean closer, pressing in with shadows. Jonah studied Elias's notebook again, focusing on a single line. The water is not just water, it is a threshold. The words rattled inside him. Elias had believed there was something beyond the ordinary hidden here. But had he found it or been consumed by it? Around midnight, the rhythmic sound returned. Stones struck together in steady beats, carried across the valley on the wind. Jonah rose, flashlight trembling in his grip. The noise grew louder, closer, until it seemed to echo directly from the river itself. Then came the voice. Not distant this time, but sharp, urgent, almost desperate. "Come back." The words sliced through the night, and Jonah froze. The voice was unmistakably male, roughened by strain, but filled with a terrifying familiarity. He had heard recordings of Elias in documentaries, lectures, interviews. This voice was his. Jonah's breath came shallow, his heart pounding against his ribs. Logic screamed that it couldn't be real. 20 years had passed, yet the valley had no concern for logic. He lowered his flashlight to the pool. The water reflected the stars like fractured glass, and in its ripples, Jonah thought he saw a shape moving below the surface, a shadow, human-like, reaching upward. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over the stones. The fire sputtered in the wind, throwing long, twisting shadows across the trees. For the first time, Jonah felt the wilderness wasn't just holding secrets. It was trying to draw him in. The river had claimed Elias, and now it was calling Jonah by name. By dawn, Jonah knew he could not leave without confronting what lay beneath the water. The photographs, the notebook entries, the voices, all of them converged on this single point. The pool was no longer just a body of water. It was a vault, guarding the truth that had consumed Elias Thorne. Jonah prepared as best he could. He rigged a rope to a nearby spruce, securing it around his waist. With a waterproof case for his camera and a headlamp strapped to his forehead, he waded slowly into the icy water. Every step sent a shock through his body, but he pressed on until the current tugged at his knees. The pool was deeper than it appeared. Within seconds, he was forced to swim, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He adjusted his headlamp and dove. Beneath the surface, the world shifted into silence and shadow. The beam of his light cut through murky green, illuminating rocks slick with algae and branches tangled like skeletal arms. He swam lower, lungs tightening, until his hand struck something solid. Wood Jonah cleared away silt and debris, revealing the unmistakable outline of a structure. Two upright beams connected by a crosspiece, like the remnants of a doorframe, exactly as Elias's final photograph suggested. It was wedged into the riverbed, unnatural in its placement, as if deliberately anchored. He ran his fingers along the surface. The wood was ancient, waterlogged but intact, and carved faintly with spirals that matched those on the stones above ground. His light flickered across the carvings, and for an instant, the water around him seemed to ripple unnaturally, bending light in patterns his eyes couldn't follow. A surge of panic clawed at him. His lungs screamed for air. He pushed off from the frame and kicked upward, breaking the surface with a gasp that echoed through the valley. He clung to the rope, dragging himself back to shore, coughing violently. On land, shivering, he stared at the pool. His mind raced. The frame was no accident. It had been built, placed, and marked. But by whom and why? Elias's words returned, haunting him. The water is not just water, it is a threshold. That night, Jonah sat by his fire, unable to sleep. Each crackle of the flames seemed to mimic the sound of stones clashing. The river hissed endlessly beside him, as if whispering secrets just beyond his comprehension. His hands trembled as he sketched the wooden frame into his journal, trying to capture every angle, every carved spiral. And then came the sound again, not distant this time, not muffled by water or wind. The stones struck together, loud and deliberate, from directly behind him. Jonah spun around, heart racing. His fire cast its glow across the clearing, illuminating only the trees. Nothing moved. No figure stood there. Yet the air carried a presence, heavy and undeniable. The wilderness was no longer a silent witness. It was responding. Elias had vanished into its depths, and now Jonah feared it had noticed him too. The days bled together in the valley, time unraveling in a haze of fear and obsession. Jonah's journal entries grew more erratic, the lines unsteady, the words rushed as though written under duress. Each night the sounds intensified, stones clashing, whispers threading through the trees. Voices carried on the current of the river. He began to sense he was being led, step by step, into the same spiral that had consumed Elias. On the fourth night, the voice returned, louder than ever before. This time, it didn't drift like an echo. It came from the clearing itself, spoken with the rasp of a man who had been calling for decades. Jonah, follow. The firelight flickered violently, throwing his shadow into grotesque shapes. Jonah grabbed his flashlight, his hand trembling so fiercely he nearly dropped it. He turned toward the sound. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, vague, blurred, yet unmistakably human. It didn't move. It only stood, waiting. Jonah's pulse thundered in his ears. He stumbled forward, each step dragging him closer to the riverbank. The figure shifted, always keeping its distance, always pulling him along. The ground seemed to slope unnaturally, the trees bending inward as if funneling him toward the pool. When he reached the water, the figure vanished. Only the black surface remained, smooth and silent as glass. Jonah's flashlight cut across the pool, and for a moment he saw it again, the wooden frame beneath the surface, glowing faintly as though lit from within. Spirals carved into its beams shimmered like molten lines, alive and pulsing. He dropped to his knees at the water's edge, his reflection fractured, his breath shallow. The river whispered with 100 voices. Some pleaded, some commanded, and beneath it all, one voice rose clearer than the rest. Elias's, it's waiting. Step through. Jonah's hand hovered over the water. The chill radiated upward, numbing his fingers before they even touched. He leaned closer, drawn to the glow, his reflection stretching into something that didn't look entirely human. His thoughts fractured. Was this discovery worth the price Elias had paid? Or was he already too far gone to turn back? The rope tied around his waist felt suddenly fragile, as though it belonged to another life. His survival gear, his maps, his notes all meaningless in the face of the threshold that pulsed just beneath the surface. One step forward, and he would be gone. Jonah teetered at the edge, the wilderness breathing around him, the pool widening into an abyss. His flashlight slipped from his hand and sank with a hiss, its beam illuminating the wooden frame one last time before vanishing into the black. The voices surged. His name was everywhere now, whispered, chanted, demanded. Jonah leaned further. The river reached for him, and in that moment he realized why Elias had never returned. The storm had swallowed the forest whole. Trees groaned under the weight of rain, the wind howled like unseen wolves, and lightning shredded the sky in furious streaks. Jonah pushed forward, drenched to the bone, his camera clutched against his chest like a lifeline. Every instinct screamed that he should turn back, but something deeper pulled him on the same invisible thread that had once drawn Elias. The path narrowed into a gorge, rocks slick with moss and mud. Jonah slipped more than once, catching himself on jagged roots, his breath ragged. Shadows seemed to press closer, and the beam of his flashlight flickered as if resisting the dark itself. He could hear something beyond the rain, faint whispers carried in the storm. They weren't his imagination. They were too sharp, too real. His recorder, hanging at his side, suddenly crackled to life without him touching it. Through the static came a voice, distant, broken, almost mournful. Jonah froze, his heart hammering. It was Elias. The words bled through the interference. Don't, follow, leave. The voice fractured into silence, swallowed by thunder. Jonah staggered forward, terror clawing at him, yet his resolve held. He reached a clearing, the same one from Elias's final photographs, and there, in the stormlight, stood the cabin. Its door was ajar, swaying in the wind as if it had been waiting for him all along. Jonah's breath caught. He was now where Elias had last stood. He knew with absolute clarity that if he crossed that threshold, he might never return. Yet his feet inched forward, as if bound by fate. For the first time, Jonah felt the weight of vanishing pressing down on him. The doorway loomed before Jonah, warped wood creaking in rhythm with the storm. His hand trembled as he pushed it open, the hinges groaning like a warning. Inside, the cabin was colder than the rain-soaked forest, a sharp, unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. The air smelled of damp earth and something older, metallic, like rusted iron or dried blood. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the remnants of a life abandoned. A table overturned, a chair split in half, shards of glass glittering faintly on the floor. The walls were carved with markings, spirals, symbols, scratches, made by hands that were either desperate or deranged. Jonah's breath hitched when his light fell upon the far wall. Pinned there, beneath layers of decay, were photographs. Dozens of them. Faces of hikers, wanderers, families smiling in the wilderness. Some were dated, names scrawled beneath. Others, bore only muddy fingerprints, and among them, Elias. His portrait stared out with lifeless eyes, the same picture Jonah had seen in the police files. But here it looked different, older, as though time had drained it, as if Elias had been claimed. Jonah's recorder hissed again. This time, the voice was stronger. "You shouldn't have come." The words weren't a warning anymore. They were an echo, a residue of someone who had stepped too far. The floorboards groaned beneath Jonah's weight. He shined the light downward and froze. A set of footprints, wet, fresh, leading deeper into the cabin. They weren't his. His chest tightened, and for the first time he understood. He was no longer following Elias's trail. Something was now leading him. Lightning struck outside, and for a split second, the cabin illuminated in blinding white. In that flash, Jonah saw a figure at the far corner, still, silent, watching. By the time the darkness returned, it was gone. Jonah's pulse raced. He had reached the edge. One step further, and he wasn't sure if he'd return. Jonah staggered back, his flashlight beam quivering over the walls. His throat was dry, but the pounding of his heart was deafening. Every instinct screamed at him to run, yet his feet felt rooted to the rotting floorboards. The photographs on the wall began to shift in his vision, faces blurring, twisting. He blinked hard, but when his eyes opened again, something was wrong. One of the photographs now bore his own face, the same picture he had taken for his journalist ID, taped crudely among the vanished. His recorder clicked again. This time, it didn't hiss, it breathed. Shallow, uneven breaths. His hand trembled as he lifted it closer. "Who's there?" Jonah whispered, his voice breaking. A whisper curled through the cabin. "You are." The footprints ahead seemed to deepen as if pressed by invisible weight, leading into a narrow hallway he hadn't noticed before. Against all reason, Jonah followed, each step dragging him deeper into silence. The air grew thick, heavy, as though the walls were closing in. At the end of the hall, a door hung ajar. He nudged it open. Inside was a single chair, and, on it, Elias Thorne's red backpack, the one never recovered. Jonah's shaking hand reached for it, but as his fingers brushed the fabric, a jolt of freezing air surged through him, and the lights of his flashlight flickered out. Darkness swallowed him whole. He gasped, stumbling, clawing at the space around him. When the lights sputtered back on, the cabin was gone. He was outside again, or what looked like outside. The trees were wrong, bent at unnatural angles. The sky a deep violet, as though dusk had never ended. He spun in place, panic rising. His compass spun wildly in his pocket. Jonah dropped to his knees. He wasn't on the map anymore. He wasn't even sure he was in the same wilderness. And for the first time, he understood Elias's final words. Unbelievable discovery. It wasn't something Elias had found. It was something that had found him. The world around Jonah twisted like a mirage. The violet sky pulsed, the bent trees groaned as though alive, and the ground beneath him seemed to breathe. He stumbled backward, clutching his recorder, whispering into it like a lifeline. "This is Jonah Miller." His voice shook. "If anyone finds this, I don't know where I am." I think he froze. The recorder hissed, then repeated his words back to him, distorted. "I don't know where I am. I think." Only the echo didn't stop. It carried on, whispering things he hadn't said. He spun, his flashlight catching fleeting movements in the tree line. Figures, dozens of them, half seen, watching with hollow eyes. Their faces flickered. Elias, the hikers, strangers lost through decades. Some lifted their hands as if beckoning. Jonah's legs moved against his will. The footprints in the soil were no longer his own. They guided him forward, deeper into the shifting wilderness. His breath came in ragged gasps. I can't fight it." The red backpack slipped from his grip, falling onto the damp earth with a dull thud. His flashlight flickered once more and died. The last sound the recorder caught was Jonah's breath, quick and terrified, before his voice dissolved into static. When search teams arrived days later, they found the backpack, the flashlight, and the recorder. The device played only a hiss, interrupted by faint whispers too warped to decipher. Jonah Miller was never seen again. Another name, another photograph added to the wall of the vanished, and the wilderness remained silent. Autumn 2045. The Alaskan wilderness was quieter now. Its trails marked by warning signs, its forests spoken of in hushed tones. Hikers still came, some for the beauty, others chasing legends. But few dared to wander where Elias Thorne and Jonah Miller had last been seen. It was a group of forestry workers clearing storm-felled trees who stumbled upon it. Half buried beneath moss and roots lay a weather-beaten camera, its casing cracked but intact. The initials scratched on the side were faint, yet unmistakable. JMTHE workers turned it over to the authorities. Experts carefully extracted the memory card, astonished it had survived 2 decades in the elements. The images they recovered silenced the room. The first photos were ordinary landscapes, tree lines, storm clouds rolling in. Then came blurred shots of the cabin interior. The wall of photographs, symbols etched in wood. The next series made hearts pound. Distorted figures in the forest, half hidden in shadow, staring directly at the lens. The final photograph froze them all. Jonah himself, standing in the violet-skied wilderness, eyes wide with terror. Behind him loomed the faint silhouette of Elias Thorne, his face pale, his hand raised as though warning or welcoming. The camera offered no answers, only deeper questions. How had it survived untouched? What realm had Jonah captured in those final images? The files were archived, debated, dismissed by skeptics as tricks of light and paranoia. But for the families of the vanished, the photographs were more than proof. They were reminders that the wilderness holds places untouched by time, places that do not let go. Elias Thorne, Jonah Miller, countless others. Their names became part of a legend whispered among hikers, told around campfires. Some discoveries aren't meant for us. Some trails aren't meant to be followed. And some vanishings aren't accidents. They're invitations. The wilderness waited, silent, patient, knowing one day someone else would wander too far.